Okay, so you know how we like to keep our fingers on the pulse of what's happening in Pakistan, right? And recently, you've brought some really interesting data to light about their oil refining industry. It seems like something's not quite adding up, and it's having some pretty big ripple effects.
Yeah, definitely.
Specifically, we're talking about high-speed diesel. Projections versus actual sales are way off, and that's putting pressure on local refineries. And one company in particular is feeling it, Pak Arab Refinery Limited. Most people know them as Parco. So today, I'm hoping with your expertise, we can take a closer look at this. Why is this happening? Who's being impacted? And what does it tell us about the bigger picture of how Pakistan's oil market operates? You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
Sounds good.
Awesome. So let's dive in, shall we?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so first things first. Can you walk me through this diesel dilemma? Like what's going on with the numbers? Sure. So the big problem is this gap in diesel demand, right?
Mhm.
OGRA, the Oil and Gas Regulatory Authority over in Pakistan, they projected this pretty high demand for high-speed diesel for March 2025. 601,300 tons to be exact.
Okay, so a lot of diesel.
Yeah, a lot.
Hmm.
But then when you look at the actual sales from the oil marketing companies, OMCs, the ones that are actually distributing and selling the stuff, it's a way different story. It came in much lower, like 487,000 tons. So that's like a difference of over 100,000 tons.
Wow, that's a huge miss. And I'm guessing that has consequences not just on paper.
Right, exactly. This isn't just some theoretical number problem. This is having a real-world impact, especially for Parco. Reports say their high-speed diesel stocks are through the roof, like 100,000 tons sitting there. That's a lot of unused diesel. And it's not just diesel either. Crude oil stocks are piling up across refineries too.
Oh, wow. So this is kind of spilling over into the whole system.
Exactly. So all this unsold product means crude oil reserves are building up. We're talking 386,000 metric tons. And this is where things get interesting. You see, OMCs, they're actually legally required to buy from local refineries first. So you'd think with that rule in place, there wouldn't be this huge surplus of locally refined diesel.
That's a good point. So what gives? Why is there all this extra diesel if they're supposed to buy local?
Well, it seems. OGRA, despite that rule about buying local, they gave a pass to two OMCs, allowing them to import 4 oil cargoes every month. So you have this push to support local refineries, but then you're also letting in imports. It seems kind of contradictory, don't you think?
It does a little bit. I mean, on the one hand, you want to support local production, but then you're also potentially undercutting them with imports. So what could have led OGRA to make such a big miscalculation?
That's the million-dollar question. It's important to remember that the industry itself had a more realistic view. They projected around 550,000 tons of diesel sales, still higher than the actual sales, but way closer than OGRA's number. This makes you wonder what methods and assumptions OGRA is using for these projections. It highlights a potential disconnect between how they're managing import allowances and local production targets. It's like even when overall demand grows, local refineries aren't necessarily reaping the benefits, which kind of defeats the purpose of that buy local rule. Makes you think about how effective the current regulations are, right?
Yeah, definitely raises some questions. Now, you mentioned this is primarily a diesel problem, but what about petrol? Is it facing similar issues?
You're right. Petrol's having a parallel situation, but less severe. OGRA projected 628,250 tons of petrol sales for March, but the actual sales were closer to 577,000 tons.
Another overestimation, but not as dramatic.
Right. And this has triggered conversations between refineries and OGRA to ensure OMCs are prioritizing locally refined petrol too. There's a wider concern about balancing supply and demand better, so our local refineries don't end up stuck with all this excess inventory because of optimistic forecasts.
So basically trying to avoid another diesel situation. Makes sense. Now, let's zoom out a little. What about overall oil sales for March? Did they increase or decrease? What does the big picture look like?
Well, taking a broader look, the total sales by OMCs reached 1.2 million tons in March. That's a 5% increase from March of last year and a 7% jump from February.
Oh, wow. So despite these hiccups with diesel sales are actually up.
Yes, overall, that month-on-month increase is partly due to what we call a low base effect. Essentially, if February sales were unusually low, maybe because of a supply disruption or something seasonal, even a moderate increase in March looks like a big jump percentage-wise.
I see. So it's all relative.
Exactly. But that year-on-year increase is more solid. Petrol and diesel prices were actually lower this March compared to last year, so that likely boosted demand.
That tracks lower prices usually mean more people are buying. Now, what about the year-to-date figures? What do those tell us?
Well, if we look at the first 9 months of the fiscal year, total sales hit 11.77 million tons. That's a 4% increase compared to the same period last year. And if we take out furnace oil, which can swing wildly depending on power generation needs, the trend is even clearer. Sales without furnace oil were up 5% year-on-year and 7% month-on-month in March. And for the 9-month period, they show a solid 7% growth.
So even with the diesel issue, the overall market is still growing.
Right, but the key is this growth isn't spread out evenly. And that brings us back to those challenges for our local refineries.
Okay, so let's break down the sales for different types of fuel in March. Back
Yeah.
to our main concern with diesel. What did the numbers look like?
Okay, so for petrol, which is also called motor spirit, they saw a small increase, 1% year-on-year and 4% month-on-month. They reached 577,000 tons.
Okay, modest growth there. Makes sense.
Now here's where it gets a little tricky with high-speed diesel. We know refineries are struggling to sell their stock, but the overall sales figures actually show a 5% increase year-on-year and a big 14% jump month-on-month. They hit 487,000 tons.
Hold on. How can diesel sales be up that much if refineries have all this excess diesel they can't get rid of? It seems like a contradiction.
It does seem that way at first, but this is a really important point to understand. That month-on-month increase doesn't necessarily mean all that diesel came from local refineries that month. It could mean OMCs were selling off existing stock they had, or that those allowed imports were hitting the market. Remember, the problem we're talking about is the mismatch between what OGRA projected local refineries would sell and what they actually sold. That's why those stocks at refineries are building up. The overall sales numbers include all diesel sold in the market no matter where it came from.
Got it. So even if diesel sales went up overall, it doesn't mean local refineries like Parco benefited, which explains why their stocks are still so high. Now, what about the other fuel types? You mentioned furnace oil and HOBC, right?
Yes. Furnace oil sales jumped 22% year-on-year and a smaller 2% month-on-month. They reached 54,000 tons.
And HOBC.
HOBC, which is the high-octane blending component, hit a record 35,000 tons in March. That was mainly because of discounts at some stations and a cut in the Petroleum Development Levy, or PDL, made it cheaper and more attractive to drivers.
So even a temporary price drop can have a big impact.
For sure. This really highlights how sensitive some parts of the market are to price changes. It suggests that maybe strategic pricing or policy tweaks could be used to influence buying habits. But the thing is, things can change fast too. That PDL on HOBC was increased again in April, so it's not a simple solution. We'll have to see how that affects sales going forward.
Yeah, those knock-on effects are important to keep in mind. Now, your data also breaks down how different companies performed in March. Can you give us a quick rundown of who's doing well and who's not?
Yeah. So Atacama Petroleum, they sold 105,000 tons total. Modest increase year-on-year and month-on-month. Their diesel sales were up 11% year-on-year and 14% month-on-month, which really helped their overall numbers. They had about 8.5% of the petrol market and just under 9% for diesel.
What about PSO, the big player?
Pakistan State Oil had a rough year-on-year drop of 14% in total sales. But they had a good month-on-month bounce back with a 9% increase. They reached 510,000 tons in March. Interestingly, they actually gained market share in both diesel and petrol compared to February, which suggests they might have been better at capitalizing on the overall increased demand. They had about 39% of the diesel market and 43% for petrol.
And we have Wafi Energy and Haskell Petroleum, too.
Right. Wafi Energy saw a 7% year-on-year decline, but they did have a 5% month-on-month increase. They reached 88,000 tons. Haskell Petroleum made a big comeback with 50,000 tons in sales. Huge jumps both year-on-year, 95%, and month-on-month, 16%. But their overall market share is still pretty small compared to the giants.
So it's a mixed bag. Some companies seem to be weathering the storm better than others.
Definitely. Yeah. There are so many factors beyond just overall demand that affect how well a company does. It's a complex market.
Absolutely. And lastly, what about the government's perspective on all this? You mentioned the Petroleum Development Levy. How much did they collect?
Well, they're aiming for a total of Rs 1.28 trillion in PDL for the whole fiscal year 2025. By the end of March, which is the first 9 months, they'd collected Rs 817 billion. That's about 64% of their target.
So fuel levies are clearly a big source of revenue for them.
For sure. And that adds another layer to this whole oil market situation.
Okay, so taking a step back, what's the big takeaway for our listeners here?
Well, the big story is that overestimation of diesel demand seems to have triggered these import allowances, which left local refineries like Parco with a mountain of unsold diesel. Even though overall diesel sales were up month on month, the situation with petrol isn't as bad, but it still points to the need for more accurate predictions and better coordination between regulators, refineries, and those OMCs. They need to strike a better balance between supply and demand.
And that brings us to the big aha moment, right?
Exactly. This shows how a small mistake in forecasting can have big consequences down the line. We're talking overflowing storage tanks for major companies and potential economic impacts.
Right. And the fact that some companies are performing better than others really shows you how complex and competitive this market is. So, as our listeners process all of this, it really makes you think about the bigger picture, right? What does this all mean for Pakistan's economic planning and energy security? How do these regulations, market forces, and energy demands all interact? This whole deep dive into their oil refining industry is just the tip of the iceberg. Lots to think about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks for breaking this all down for us. It's been really insightful.
My pleasure. Glad to be here.
And for our listeners, if you want to learn more, be sure to check out the sources we've linked in the show notes. Until next time, happy exploring.